Remember that anything called a clause automatically has a subject and a verb. An adjective clause is a type of dependent or subordinate clause. Because it's got that word adjective attached to it, we know it modifies a noun or a pronoun. All adjective clauses modify nouns or pronouns. Most adjective clauses begin with a trigger word called a relative pronoun, and there are only 5 in the whole language: who, whom, whose, that, and which. On occasion, one will begin with a subordinating conjunction, sometimes called a relative adverb, such as where or when. Fortunately, this list is very short. It would be a good idea to memorize them. Because adjective clauses begin with relative pronouns or those conjunctions, they are sometimes called relative clauses. I use the term relative and adjective clause interchangeably. Both are types of dependent or subordinate clauses. Let's look at some examples. The pizza that I shared with Stan was delicious. First of all, look for that trigger word. In this sentence, it's one of your 5 relative pronouns, that. Then, find the rest of the clause by looking for a subject and a verb. So we have I and shared. Notice that if we eliminate the relative pronoun, we would have 2 independent clauses. The pizza was delicious and I shared with Stan. Both clauses have subjects, pizza, and of course I, and both have verbs, was, and of course shared. It's the relative pronoun that makes one of the clauses subordinate to or dependent on the other. Remember from our discussion of complex sentences that the subordinate clause will always begin with a trigger word, no matter where the clause is in the sentence. Now remember that adjective clauses modify nouns or pronouns. Also, by now I'm sure you know that adjectives are always adjacent to the things they modify, unless they are predicate adjectives. So in this sentence, there's only one thing our adjective clause can possibly modify, and that's pizza. Let's test it anyway by dragging out our old friends, the adjective questions. Which pizza? The one that I shared with Stan. That works. Let's look at a couple more. Students who take good notes generally get good grades. We'll begin by finding the trigger word, who, another relative pronoun. When trying to find the whole clause, begin by finding the main clause. Here we have students generally get good grades. All the rest is your adjective clause, who take good notes. Another way you can check is to find both subjects and both verbs, like we did in the last sentence. In relative clauses, it will sometimes look like there is no subject. In that case, the relative pronoun itself is the subject. So here we have students as the subject of our main clause and who as the subject of our subordinate clause. For our verbs, we have get, the verb in our main clause, and take is the verb in our subordinate clause. Now, because there are 2 nouns in my main clause, students and grades, I have to choose which one I think the subordinate clause modifies. This should be no problem for you because only one of the nouns is adjacent to the relative clause. Students. Let's test it. Which students? The ones who take good notes. I remember a time when football was less violent. Here our trigger word is a conjunction, when. Can you see what your adjective clause is? Let's begin by finding both clauses. Look for a subject and a verb in each. In the main or independent clause, we have as our subject I and our verb remember. Time is a direct object in our main clause. In the subordinate clause, we have subject, football, and verb was. What does the clause modify when football was less violent? Since the adjective clause is at the end of the sentence, it must modify the word that comes right before it, time. Which time? A time when football was less violent. Here's a tip about adjective clauses. They will never begin a sentence. They can modify the first word but cannot begin the sentence. Let's look at one more for good measure. 2 kids he has coached have played in the majors. I'm throwing you a curveball here, but let's see if you can figure it out. There doesn't seem to be a trigger word, so what do? Does that mean that there's no adjective clause? Well, let's see. If I break this sentence down, I can see 2 distinct clauses. I know this because the subject of the sentence, kids, is followed by a pronoun, he. We can't have 2 subjects and only 1 verb, so I know there have to be 2 clauses. What have the kids done? They have played in the majors. That's my independent clause, or my main clause. What's left? Another subject, he, and another verb, has coached. So I have 2 clauses. 2 kids have played in the majors, and he has coached. But which one is the main clause, and which one is subordinate? Here you need to apply some common sense. Step back and ask yourself what the sentence is about overall. It's about kids playing ball. Now I know my main clause is 2 kids have played in the majors. Also, only the subordinate clause, he has coached, is capable of modifying anything, in this case, kids. Which kids? The ones he has coached. On occasion, the relative pronoun will be implied, but fear not, you have the tools to figure this out. Now we have one more thing to learn about adjective clauses. They can be classified as either essential or non-essential. Essential clauses cannot be removed without changing the basic meaning of the sentence. Essential and non-essential clauses are sometimes also called restrictive and non-restrictive clauses. The 2 terms are interchangeable. Let's look at some examples. I visited the Sahara Desert where water was scarce. And here, I visited the town where the crime rate was very high. Both of these sentences have adjective clauses. Say, trigger word, where water was scarce. The town, the same trigger word, where the crime rate was very high. So these are my subordinate clauses. Only one of them is essential, however. If we eliminated the clause where water was scarce from this sentence, what do we lose? Nothing. Everyone knows that in a desert, water is scarce. Therefore, this clause is non-essential or non-restrictive. In this sentence, the adjective clause where the crime rate was very high is essential. If we removed it, we lose an important bit of information about the town. Since we can't assume that crime rates are high in all towns, we need this clause. It's essential or restrictive. Let's look at one more pair. The game which we played on Saturday ended in a tie. The game that we played on Saturday ended in a tie. Since these 2 sentences are almost exactly alike, how are we to tell the difference? Actually, the differences are very small. There are only subtle differences in meaning. In the first one, the adjective clause, which we played on Saturday, is just extra information. Our sentence doesn't change in meaning if we eliminate it. It's therefore a non-essential clause. In the second sentence, however, we can assume there is more than one game. We need the adjective clause that we played on Saturday to indicate which game ended in a tie. Take a second and think about it. You'll get it. Here's a tip. Non-essential clauses often begin with the word which and are usually encased in commas. Essential clauses often begin with that and do not have commas around them. That's true in both of our examples.